The pandemic started. The models that I'd been painting from for years stopped coming. The young ladies retired. And I decided to do a series of watercolor paintings of the various objects I've collected over the years. There's no real plan to my collection. Some things are ancient, others newer. Many of them are simply the least expensive objects I could find, in a way. Nobody else was interested. What you're looking at is a camel from the Chinese Han Dynasty, which roughly corresponds to the time of ancient Rome. And a number of years ago, excavations for reservoirs were made right in the Han Dynasty tomb area. As the area flooded, the farmers dug all this stuff up and sold them to guys who came to collect. And one of my former students was married to a Chinese lady whose brother was right there on the spot. And he sent back as many of these objects as he could. And they had a place in a storeroom and held auctions for dealers across the country. And then I would go in after the auction, which was every 2 or 3 weeks, and I would take something that hadn't been bid on for myself. I would pay, of course. This camel was one of the first objects I got from them. It's Han Dynasty, was in fragments. It's been put back together. The other object is a piggy bank in the form of a donkey with wings, which struck me as a real oddity. I put the two together. This is in my house in New Jersey. Where I spend many of my weekends. This is my setup in the living room. That's a cactus plant. And you see the sofa against the wall further back. Now I started adding color to the camel. This is a view of the house. Here is the painting completed. I've painted in watercolors since my high school days. I decided to do a watercolor of this object, which I've had for many years, and it's just sitting. The birds totally ignore it. But I think it's a wonderful object. I got it in Maine about 40 years ago. This is the setup, my working setup in the garden at the house in New Jersey. This is the line drawing. An overall view of the garden and the house. This was simply a dessert. Back to the painting. And the painting of the bird bath itself is completed, and now I'm adding the background. This is just simply miscellaneous views around. And I see this as a possible new painting while I'm continuing. And this is the completed watercolor. I decided to leave it as a vignette. unfinished around the edges. At a certain point, I like the look of it. But I've set up my easel now to do this. The cast iron turtle, which is a sprinkler, a water sprinkler, and the planter. That planter. This is another possible subject, and I've set up to work on rainy days inside the house at the lake. That's a flying goose or duck, I'm not sure, but it's quite large. It's a weather vane, the only one I've ever seen like it, and the other figure is a weather vane, but it's a Hessian soldier of the English army that went through this area when it was first being investigated in pre-colonial times. And I've never seen another one like it, but I arranged them so it would look like the Hessian soldier is confronting the flying goose. Candlesticks on the fireplace mantle, which is that log. This is working on the line drawing. Now, this is an image that I started in the studio in New York. I spent weekends in New Jersey and weekdays in New York. And this, I decided this collection of Asian marionettes would be a nice subject for watercolor. This is the second session. I started with the wall shading. Back to New Jersey, and the first weekend of painting it. In the meantime, spent a couple days working on this. I alternate between the paintings. They develop simultaneously, overlapping. This is a view of the garden from the living room window, the watercolor developing. The delineation of the stone is down below the mantle. And the following one I've added above the mantle as well. This is simply under different light condition. Back to the animals in the city. This is back to the lake house, and I decided to do one of a stuffed owl that I've had for many years. I don't know if it's a native owl, and it's on a stump of wood, and below it I added a collection of what are called tree mushrooms. I don't know what the actual name is. I place it around the bottom. Here at the Watercolor at the studio on 36th Street developing. Each shot represents the end of a working session. The owl is being painted out of doors. This is 36th Street, the owl's in New Jersey. And this looks like the final, or very close to the final, the watercolor of the hanging marionettes. This is my next setup in my studio on 36th Street. It's a collection of ancient Greek objects, Hellenistic objects of different periods. The two clay figures represent actors. Back in New Jersey, and the owl is completed. And this is a Chinese roof tile, probably 19th century, that I decided would be my next painting. My roof tile in place is a line drawing. And back to the studio on 36th Street. The two terracotta male figures or actors' votives, offerings. the line drawing complete, starting the color. This just happens to be a bunch of mushrooms bought at the local grocery store by my son-in-law, adding the background. I decided to complete it further, not to leave it as a vignette. This is a weather vane I bought many years ago in Maine when I went as a visiting artist to an art school. My grandson, the house at the studio on 36th Street. This is at the lake after a shopping spree. Back to my weather vane painting. Just an overall view of the property. And I think this is the close to finish. The weather vane. Then we spent a week up on Cape Cod. These photos were taken there. The house we stayed in at Cape Cod. I found the trees looking very odd, like skeletons, some of them. But I decided first to paint this tree root, and I left it as a vignette. A rainbow over an ice cream stop. The second watercolor I did at Cape Cod. The final shot. The actual trees, I decided if we go back next year, I would do that. Anyway, the ocean can get very rough. This is when we returned from Cape Cod. I decided to continue with the fireplace. These are two owl andirons that we bought at a local antique store. They're cast iron with glass eyes. Back to the Greek watercolor. Back to the owls. The last minute I added this decoy because there seemed to be an empty space. And here is the watercolor, virtually complete. Back to painting the classical scene and back to the watercolor in New Jersey of the andirons. That's almost complete. And this is now complete. The vase in the middle represents padded dancers, which I guess was meant to be funny, and it's a Corinthian vase. The smaller round one with the, looks like a black duck or something, is also Corinthian. The small vase up front on the left is Athenian, Athens, red figure vase. And the one that's intruding on that right or left edge is Etruscan, but they all more or less coincide in time. That's our dog. That's Bo sleeping at the lake. Next comes the Han Dynasty warriors. The line drawing. The following weekend, back to finishing this final little touches. The Corinthian vase in the middle took the longest time, of course. Now I've added the view out the window. And this is a new setup on 36th Street. That's a black figured Greek vase, which comes earlier than the red figure. But it represents Priam, who's there with the white beard, and the warrior putting on the armor, Hector. And Athena is handing Hector his armor. The vase in the background is pre-Etruscan, but it's a wonderful object. And this is the final of the Han Dynasty horses. A new setup at the lake house. I don't know what animal that skull is from, but I found it in a local antique store, and it's posing with those shell mushrooms. Back in New York, this is about completed. And this is my next setup at 36th Street, part of my collection of decoys. This is a photograph I took out of my fire escape window. Unfortunately, the sunset isn't static. It wouldn't stay there long enough for me to make a painting of it. And I've not yet made a painting from a photograph, but that's a possibility.